Welcome back to Dan's Messy Garage. This is day 2 of working on the 63 Falcon Sprint Project. To my surprise, the intake gaskets peeled right off. Normally you have to scrape and scrape on those. And even the little cork China wall gaskets popped right off. I mean, they're petrified, but they came right off, so that's a big plus. And the engine is in good shape inside. I don't know the history of it, and the owner doesn't know the history because he's only had the car about 1.5 years or so. And it's not full of scum. You know, it's clean, looks good. So this should take minimal cleanup with the gasket on. I don't use the cork gaskets on it. These are called China walls. Here and that wall back there. I use, like most people, a Beat RTV on there. Seals better, easier, lasts longer. And I gotta stop yakking and start working. I have carburetor cleaner, brake cleaner, starting fluid. I'm gonna see which one works best on the gunk that's in here, on the gasket surface. Maybe a combination of all of them, who knows? Alright, here we go. That seems to be working fair. That's brake cleaner. Chunk of paper towel. I'll try carburetor cleaner next. That might work even better. I'd say yes, that works better so far. Okay, that's carburetor cleaner. And starting fluid. It's my favorite go-to cleaner because it doesn't take paint off or tack plastics. It just does a wonderful job of cleaning grease and oil. Well, I'm going to say the carb cleaner seems to take the residue off there easiest. So I'm going to clean all that up with carb cleaner. I just dropped the intake on there with no gaskets, no bolts, just for testing purposes. The carburetor is just slid on, not bolted, no gaskets. No gaskets are harmed in the making of this video. Anyways, looking at the dilemma with the throttle. This little lever here is all there is hooked in a car, and that's not going to work. This carburetor linkage, I'm going to do this one-handed here. The bottom portion, down where my thumb is, that moves approximately 1.5 inches, maybe 1 5/8 inches in that direction. This lever, that would be idle, that would be full throttle. So this lever is pulling back for throttle. Now I'm going to have to take that off there, cut that, and weld it so it's sticking up on a better angle. I need to rethink this though, because if I'm going to cut that off, I'm probably going to make a different lever coming up over here, so I could just run a rod from one of these holes back to that lever, so it's more in line and works better. Because I took this big contraption thing out of there. Let me move the old carburetor. They had this bell crank affair sitting on there, and it didn't work right. I mean, it was sloppy. I mean, you pushed the pedal a lot, and this would move before it would do anything with the carburetor. And it just had a crappy feel. Plus, the bolt where it bolts to the intake, those two holes on an angle, and on the intake in the car, it's like that. But I want to do away with this whole mechanism. That might be worth something to somebody, but it's really not worth much for this project. I have a bunch of scrap metal. I've done stuff like this before, so I can come up with a viable solution. So I have to ponder this for a few minutes, and then I'll bring you back and let you know what I decided. Trying to get the camera positioned where I can show you this. In the Falcon, the gas pedal from the factory feels like it has about 3 to 3.5 inches from idle to full throttle. The pedal pivots on the floor under here somewhere, comes up through the carpet. It's bolted to the floor under the carpet, and the top of it pushes on an arm, and that arm is about 8 inches long where it pivots in the firewall. So we got like 3 or 3.5 inches of travel here on an 8-inch long rod sticking through the firewall. Okay, now I'm under the hood. The carb's at idle. Choke is off. If I measure from the firewall to this location where this little arm would hook to the carburetor, I get roughly 13 inches. Now there's another location higher, this big hole. I could use the center of that if I had to get more throw. That is, let's say 13.5. I'm gonna write that down. So we got 13 and 13.5. Okay. Now, at wide open throttle, you gotta hold this choke open to do this. That's wide open. Firewall back to the same point, about 11.25, and 11 and 11.25. So we have roughly 2.5 inches, really? Verify, 13, full throttle, 11, no, 1 3/4 of an inch. I don't know how my math, okay, 1 3/4 of an inch. So we have 1 3/4 of an inch carb throw. Okay. I'm doing this all to get to the point here. So I only have 1 3/4 of an inch this way. That lever is 8 inches long inside the car. So I did some mock-up little levers here. This is not how it's going to be. This is mock-up purposes only. So I got a big long one here that'll swing back and forth with the foot pedal. But this can only go 1 3/4 from idle to wide open. Now when you take an 8-inch long lever, let me see if I can illustrate this on paper. All right, this is the firewall, this is the gas pedal, and it has about 3.5 inches of travel in that direction. The lever that it pushes on is 8 inches long, and if that moves 3.5 inches, and if this were 8 inches out here, then to get this to 3.5 inches here, this would move 3.5 inches out here. But the carburetor is here, and the positions to put the lever or the rod that's going to go from the carburetor to this link arm are here and up here, and that's only got 1 3/4 inches. I don't think that distance here is viable in the car. No, it looks like that's got to be 4 or 5 inches. What I'm getting to, yes, this will work, but the gas pedal is going to have very little movement for your foot. Right now I happen to have at my disposal to measure 1, 2, I have 5 cars around here, well 4 cars in a van. Then I'm going to go out and measure how much throttle pedal travel they have, because all those drive fine. See, if you have this only so it's moving, you know, like 2 inches, that's, you know, from idle to full throttle. Just picture your foot. You know, that's not going to be fun to drive, especially with a clutch. So I'm going to go measure some cars. Of course, it's raining, but in a van, it's an E350 van, I'm going to try to measure this. Oh, it's going to be tough. 1.5 inches. Three and a half, so that's only 2 inches, eh? Yeah, that's really hard to measure. How about down here? That's going to exaggerate it though. 2.5 to 3 inches. Less than I thought. Let's go to the next car. This is my Fusion everyday driver. Looks like we're starting out about 3.5 from the floor. Goes down to 1. So that's 2.5. I may be worrying about nothing. Go to the next car. All right, my brother's Monarch. Looks like it's starting out around 5. About 3 inches travel. Okay. All right, I've been playing with this linkage in here, coming up with different arms and all this for probably an hour and a half now. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to have to mock this up. I'm going to have to come up with a way to anchor this rod or this lever to the rod temporarily so I can mock up a linkage from the carburetor to this lever, and then just get in the car and see how it feels with your foot. 2.5, 3 inches is what the other cars are measuring. I didn't bother measuring the last 2 cars. It's raining, I was already getting wet. Yeah, I'm a baby. So I'm gonna mock it up, see how it feels, and if it's good, then I'm gonna come up with a permanent solution. Okay, I made a proof of concept model type thing here. This represents the pivot in the firewall. Right here is the gas pedal at 3.5 inches from the firewall. And the gas pedal would be indicated like right here. So when it swings over to this position, I drew a line up here and I started out with a line here. Since the pivot's here, I measured out in increments along these holes here. That hole, that hole, that hole. And I was marking it from, let's say, idle to wide open throttle. And I made these holes here, there, and there. Then measuring the arc between these holes, this one here is about 1 3/4, 1 7/8, somewhere in that area. So that would be the distance I need. So it'll be from here to there. So that arm needs to be that long. Now I'll make the arm a little longer so I could drill holes into it if I have to. It's not going to be made out of this. This is mock-up purposes only. Just so I could get a better understanding of how long that arm needs to be. I'm going to take a piece of 1 inch wide by 1/8 inch thick flat stock. I'm going to cut it off here. Pivot's going to be here, welded to that shaft somehow. And then I'm going to have holes. Now this hole here, I don't know if it shows up on the camera, but I marked it with a pencil. That's going to be probably the hole that'll work. But I'm going to leave extra room up here to, drill more holes if I have to. If this works out fine and feels good in the car, I'll cut that off. That's the plan. Now it's time to implement it. Okay, this is what I came up with. Got a piece of steel, welded a nut to it, and then I drilled and tapped for a set screw. This will slide over that stub shaft down there and give me some adjustability before I tighten it. I was fixing to weld this thing on there. Then I thought, if I don't have this in the right position when I weld it, I'm in for a lot more work. So it'd be better if this was removable in the future too. So once I get everything squared away and I tighten this screw down, that's going to mark that shaft. Then I can drill a partial, not all the way through, but let's say 1/4 of the way down in there, drill a hole, and then that set screw go down into that hole and really lock this thing on the shaft so there's no slop. So now I need to mock it all up, put a return spring on it, get in the car and step on the pedal and see where I'm at. I'm going to do a mock-up test. I just bent a piece of rod to represent what's going to be there. That's not permanent. That spring's not permanent. And I just put a socket in the choke here to keep that open so that I can get full throttle movement. Because if the choke is partially closed, you can't get into the 4-barrel secondary linkage. That's got to be open before it'll go wide open. see how it feels inside the car. You know what? That feels good. There's partial throttle, just a little bit. There's wide open. Success. I think the whole location's in good, right where it's at. It's in a good spot. I'm about to put the intake on. It's the intake gaskets. They're Felpro. These aren't marked that says, you know, against head or anything like that. Let's see, what number are these? 901031. They come with cork gaskets. They're going directly into my circle file right there. And they have a new distributor O-ring. I will put that on the distributor, but those things right there. There's the arm in position. That set screw is tight. Set screw right there. I cut the arm off, rounded it, sanded all the edges smooth. I'll sandblast that and paint it black. It'll look fine. And I took some, whatchamacallit, I'm using Permatex Optimum Max Flex RTV block silicone. I took some on the back side of the gasket where it meets these are water ports at the end. Just there on those four corners. That's the only place I put it. And I'll put some on this side of it too, because I don't want a water leak. You know, antifreeze leaking out of there. You don't need anything on the other ports. And these gaskets work just like the ones I put on the 302 in my 302 build series. There's a little tab or a little finger that locks under the head gasket. So that keeps it from sliding around or moving. I'm going to put a generous bead of RTV across here, across the back. I'll do the same on the bottom of the intake. Do a bead, and then let it set up for a few minutes. Drop the intake on, and then just proceed to bolt her in. I'll follow the torque sequence and torque spec, but I'm not going to record all that. I'll bring you back after the intake's on. Alright, what I did, I put in like a stud, let's call it, in each corner, opposite corners. That's going to be like a guide pin for me to drop the intake straight down on there. I got a bead silicone across both China walls. And hang on. Technical difficulties. And on the bottom of the intake, I put a bead. And it's been hardening up for a few minutes. And what I'll do is drop this down. If I can grab this without smearing things. Drop this down on those pins. And then it's going to go straight onto the block. Get hung up here. There we go. Straight down. A little wiggle jiggle. Alright, now those two beads of silicone on the ends of the intake are sticky. They're going to glue it together, prevent oil leaks. Now I can take my little guide pins out of here and start to install all the bolts. New development here. These outside bolts on each end, they just go into, let's just call it air. They're outside the engine. The other ones, there's 2, 4, 6, 8 go into the intake area of the engine where there's oil. And what you should do, or could do, or I do, is I take some thread sealant and put it around the top portion of the bolt here where it's going through the intake to block any oil that could possibly come up through there. Here's what I discovered. These bolts are from the intake I took off. They're not really long enough for this. These thread bosses are higher than the old intake. So these bolts need to be a good 1/4 inch longer. You drop them in there and there's hardly any thread engagement to tighten it. So I'm gonna have to run up to Ace Hardware and get 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 bolts 1/4 inch longer. I'll be back in a few. Another development. I went up to Ace Hardware, got the bolts. Now, I wish I'd have known I had needed bolts before I went to O'Reilly and got the RTV that I used, because they're in the same complex. I could have had 2 stops, 1 trip. Anyways, new development is I got bolts. They only had 2.5 inch or 2 inch. I needed like 2 1/4. They had 2 1/4 inch bolts, but they were in chrome, and it was $5 for one 2 1/4 inch chrome bolt. 12 of them would have been $60 plus whatever the washers cost. It's outrageous. So I bought the 2.5s, did a test fit. And they go in, but not all the way. I don't know if you can see this, but the bolt is in until it's stopped. You know, I wasn't reefing on it, just threaded it in there. It stops. And the washers are loose. You can spin them. So each bolt is going to have to be cut down about 1/4 inch. I've had it. You know, I'm done for today. It's already 6 o'clock. I started in here around 9 o'clock. Now, I wasn't working the entire, 7 hours is that? I can't even think. 9 to 3, 6, 9 hours? Yeah, well, 9 hours. I probably have maybe 4.5 hours, I'll have to figure it out, of actually working. The other time was me getting something to eat. Somebody came to visit. I had phone calls. I had distractions. So even though it was a long day, I was only doing something on the car half of the day. But I've had it for today. This is going to be the end of day 2. When things start to go like this, where they're just going wrong, and, you know, I'm dropping things, or it's time for me to quit. So, this is the end of day 2, working on the 63 Falcon Sprint. Day 3, I should have it running. Thanks for watching the video, and have a good evening. Bye.